It's been almost 2 months and the Arab world is still on fire. The trigger was December 17th in Tunisia and then Egypt on January 25th. For several weeks, demonstrations intensified, morphing from economic grievances to governance and corruption. What are the real differences between both revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt? What are the possible ramifications? And how would this impact on shaping the future in both countries? And finally, does people's power actually work? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Divya Gopalan. When asked about the uprising in Tunisia, the Egyptian Foreign Minister Ahmed Abu al-Gheit said this is pure nonsense, adding that Egypt is in a completely different position compared to Tunisia. But events since then seem to prove him wrong. In both countries now, the old regime has made desperate attempts to survive by offering unprecedented concessions, perhaps in an attempt to neutralize the revolution. So let's now have a quick look at the similarities and differences in the situations in Egypt and Tunisia. Both countries have seen dramatic rises in the cost of living in recent years. There are accusations of corruption among the ruling elite. Many protesters in both Egypt and Tunisia come from educated middle class. But scratch below the surface and you will find marked differences between the two countries, such as the role of the media. Until the fall of Ben Ali, Tunisia had a strictly controlled media with severe restrictions on what could be reported. The press in Egypt had a bit more variety, although the state exerted pressure on editors and journalists in different ways when needed. The role of the internet. Unlike Tunisia, Egypt had a less restrictive approach to social media, such as Facebook and Twitter, leading up to the revolution. Tunisian protesters have been forced to rely more heavily on cell phone text messages and word of mouth. And finally, the role of the army. In Tunisia, the army played a crucial role in the revolution. The military never gave its backing to the president, but in Egypt, the military is still sitting on the fence. Well, joining us now are our guests. In Tunis, we have Fidaa al-Hammami. She's a Tunisian activist, and she's been a regular guest here on Inside Story since the beginning of the revolutions of both Egypt and Tunisia. In Sydney, we have Gennaro Gervasio, a lecturer at Macquarie University in Sydney and a visiting professor at American University in Cairo. And in London, we have Yusuf Elbaz. He's representing Egyptian activists in the UK. Well, thank you very much for joining us. Now, if I can start with you, Fidaa al-Hammami, and I want to ask you to bring us through what Tunisia has achieved so far. You've had the protests, you've had a change in government. Where are you now?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me again to the show. And I want to greet the protesters in Egypt and say that we in Tunisia support their fight for freedom and democracy. As for Tunisia, well, we had won a lot, but the road is still long. The government seems not to have understood its people yet. We had the change in the cabinet due to pressure, due to the sit-in in front of the first ministry. But there are a lot of things that are still remain unsatisfactory, like appointing governors for the internal towns that are ex or still RCD members, that is the Ben Ali's party, that really exhausted the country.
If I could bring Yusuf Elbaz in. Now, you've been watching the protests very closely in Egypt and have been active to a certain extent. How far has Egypt come?
We started in the process just like Tunisia did. We wanted to get our message clear and heard that the current system of governance of Egypt through a single person, a dictatorship, was not acceptable, and we needed fair and free elections and the right of sort of freedom of speech and so forth. But what we have learned from our Tunisian brothers and sisters is the need for a deep cleanse. What we saw in Tunisia was a two-wave revolution. It started with a populist movement and then a second populist movement to make sure the government understood that a change in the top echelons is not sufficient. A deeper cleanse was required, and thus a more sustained change in the government ministers, which is what we saw when some of the old ministers retained power. And in Egypt, we're doing this today. We've pushed harder, and we're going to push again to make sure that not just the National Democratic Party resign, but we see the full regime and system that sort of woven itself into institutionalized corruption in Egypt is removed.
Dr. Gennaro Gervasio, what we have seen here in Tunisia happened at great speed. But if you look at Egypt, there was a certain amount of movement and now there's somewhat of an impasse. Why is that?
I mean, the Tunisian uprising and the way it went, and also the way that it was, I mean, at the very beginning successful, particularly when Ben Ali decided to leave the country suddenly, it had a huge impact in Egypt. I mean, I remember I was in Cairo in those days, and the Egyptians were following almost obsessively the way events were going in Tunisia. And I remember the media, of the state-run media, they were very, very quick in dismiss any similarities. And I remember an op-ed written just maybe 5 days before the beginning of the Egyptian demonstrations. And I remember this person, the editor of al-Hammami giving 5 reasons for which they will not be repeatable, but in fact they were both, all these 5 reasons, they were enough to have the Egyptian situation inflaming, if not even more, of a quicker pace than the Tunisian one.
Fidaa al-Hammami, bringing it back to leadership, can you tell us what the process is now from here? Why are people still protesting there?
Well, because like our friend said, we need a cleansing and eradication of all symbols of oppression from our government, from our Tunisia, our free Tunisia now. This didn't happen, not with the old cabinet and not with the new cabinet. People that were deeply in the corrupted regime of Ben Ali and his corrupted party are still in power, are still in governors, are still in the big institutions, the important institutions. And as long as we do have these people in decision positions, we cannot say that we won or that we eradicated oppression or corruption from Tunisia. So the fight continues. Protests are not massive, are not big, and we're working and we're going to school, but we have to stay alert, we have to stay vigilant, and we have to be the ones that pressure the government always to eradicate these symbols.
Meanwhile, 2 weeks on, we have a very different picture in Egypt. Mubarak has offered to step down, but people are still protesting. Why do you think things haven't moved there? Why is there not, or is there a credible opposition that can take his place? And I'm going to put this to Mr. Youssef El-Baz.
Sure, it's quite an interesting thing. In our opinion, we've heard this sort of scaremongering spin coming out of the Mubarak regime, which unfortunately some Western reporters and sources have fallen into. They've believed this idea that there's a vacuum of power that will come into place. It was very ironical to hear the Vice President of Egypt, or the newly installed Vice President, Omar Suleiman, use the constitution as the reason as to why Mubarak could not leave so quickly. The reason we say the irony shines out at us is it's that very same constitution that would put in place the head of the parliamentary speaker as the head of an interim caretaker government that would see us go through 60 days of electoral reform and take us through to a free and fairly elected representation into the Egyptian parliament. No, I'm afraid we definitely don't buy into this sort of vacuum of power solution, and that there's nowhere we could go to.
The one interesting thing in all of this is the role of the army. And Mr. El-Baz, if I can put it to you, how involved do you think the army has been, and how much more do they need to do, if anything at all?
In terms of the army, it's a very interesting one. A lot of people on the ground level in Cairo are confused as to why the army haven't totally heartedly stood with the people. We saw in Tahrir Square, our version of Tiananmen Square in China last week, is the army took 2 steps back as the police entered the square and started killing and attacking civilians. And so we've learned one thing, is that the army don't have the full-hearted interest of the people in their minds. But what we do understand is the connection between the army and Mubarak. At the end of the day, the Mubarak regime, or Mubarak himself, acts as a focal point for the army, which holds America's $1.5 billion vote. So the army will not do anything to jeopardize that relationship with the US and indeed the funding that guarantees its existence. And what we would like to say is, dear Army, you can maintain that funding with the Americas, you can contain the sustained peace process without Mubarak as being your spokesman. The Army are good people and they should stand in their own right.
This is to Dr. Gennaro Gervasio. We're talking about the army right now and the role of the army, and we've just been in Tunisia. They played a very, very distinct role in the ousting of their leader. In Egypt, we're not exactly seeing that. Can you explain why such a disparity?
Well, I mean, this is also the nature of the regime. Let's not forget that Ben Ali, he was brought to power with an internal coup by the police, by the internal ministry, by the security forces. And also, even before Habib Bourguiba, the founder of the Tunisian state, he was very afraid of the power of the army, what was happening in Egypt and Levant, so he tried to keep the army outside of politics, whilst the Egyptian revolution of 1952 was in fact a military coup, a revolution led by the military, and in the military they stayed in power. And also, one has also to think that, of course, typically the revolutions, or even, they come from the middle and lower ranks of the army. At the moment, I think it's not, the differences within the Egyptian army have not been maybe crystallized, are not clear yet. Clearly, the highest ranks, they are very close to Mubarak and even closer to Omar Suleiman. Let's not forget that he's closer to the army. He's army much more than the president. I mean, the president, of course, comes from the army, but he got much more a civilian role now. Whilst in Tunisia, the army was always outside, and I don't think they had interest, not even the capability maybe of getting in defending the old regime. While of course in Egypt, at least the highest ranks, they have much more to lose if Mubarak goes, or even if the situation is unclear. Plus, as Youssef was saying from London, they still command respect from the population, even if the way they have behaved, like the sort of neutrality which sometimes has been considered a bit too close to the regime. But I think that it's very difficult to know what's happening within, and particularly how much the highest and the middle and the lowest rank are in contrast at the moment. But the two armies are very different stories.
I'd like to bring in one of Youssef's points. He said the fact that the West has an influence in the army receives a huge amount of aid from the US. How much of a factor has that been in slowing down the so-called revolution?
Absolutely. I mean, the army had within its full capability to simply face up to President Mubarak and say, your place here is illegitimate, or at least by popular demand, we need to look after and caretake Egypt into the next stages of freedom and stability. But Mubarak has sold himself very well as the spokesman and the broker between the Egyptian army and the United States. I once met General Tantawi, head of the Egyptian army, a very, I wouldn't say docile, but a very peaceful and sensible and kind man. He is very a patriarchal type of person. And he's not necessarily the type of person or at the right stage in his career or age to become an activist to really protect the Egyptian people against, and work against the US or work around, circumvent Mubarak. Mubarak and his son Gamal, who is well known for walking around in the lobbies of the Senate in Washington, they've played that broker game very, very well.
Dr. Gervasio, I saw you nod there. What do you say to that? What do you say to the West's influence on the Egyptian army?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure. In terms of course, the army receives most of the aid, but of course the aid goes to the regime, and the army has always been the sort of guarantee of the regime. I mean, there was never been an attempt to reduce the power, the influence, or the prestige of the Egyptian army, even if we have to say that the army intervened in the streets only once before, in 1977, to repress the old bread intifada, the uprising for the bread in 1977. And this is what also kept the nationalistic role. I mean, clearly, I mean, the army is the only guarantee against the collapse of the state, but I'm against I mean, I think that also the idea of army needs to be problematized. I think there are more than one soul within the Egyptian army, and maybe in these hours something is happening inside the army, because I don't think that if the protests go on, you know, the middle ranks and even the upper ranks of the army will be happy, and so maybe a sort of solution, even a sort of dignified exit for Mubarak should be found. The thing is that the crucial point is how much Suleiman can still be in charge, much more than Mubarak, because, you know, after his declaration, this is not the problem anymore. And this is, I mean, the aid is, at this point, the Western interest that the army does not collapse as it happened in Iran in 1979, because that will create, you know, chaos or whatever, you know, might frighten the West, and of course the Arab world and a lot of Egyptian ordinary people. So to make sure that the army does not collapse, I think that is the interest. And also I think it's the interest of the people who are in the army itself, and they might be ready to sacrifice Mubarak and the highest ranks should this be necessary.
Dr. Gervasio, if I can just widen this out once more, if you look at the overall picture here, if you had to compare Tunisia and what is happening in Egypt, what would you say are the similarities?
Well, the similarity lie in the reasons for the uprising, which was a way, I mean, a strong, the loudest answer of the Arab youth, both in Tunisia and in Egypt, to the neoliberal policies that both countries have been adopted at huge social cost. I mean, at the end of the day, in Egypt the situation was worse than in Tunisia, because whilst Tunisia had that sort of economic miracle thanks to the support of the EU, in particular Italy and France, and much less Egypt. That was not the case of Egypt, where there has been an economic and social crisis ongoing. And in fact, you had protest movements and strikes almost every day for the last 3 years. I've been living in Egypt, I mean, I've been spending at least 3 months per year before the last 6 months in a row, and there were barely a day was going on without a sit-in, a protest happening, not just in Cairo, where most of the focus is, but everywhere. So, I mean, the sense of dissatisfaction was already there, and this is the common thing. And also the explosion was more or less the same. Then, of course, the Egyptian regime is somehow stronger, or let's say more ready to confront. Also, it's bigger. The army is bigger. The security apparatus was bigger. But in terms of the motivation behind those uprisings, they might well spread elsewhere. I mean, they are just the same. And it's the Arab youth that it's reclaiming its own place in politics after being excluded for so many years. We are having this educated, what will be middle class for us in Europe or elsewhere, is in fact being impoverished. So, you know, that was highly likely to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Fidaa, al-Hammami, can I put this to you? Do you agree that maybe the transition in Tunisia will be far easier than what you are seeing in Egypt? Do you think that it is you're essentially getting there with fewer problems?
I don't think so, because we do have different problems when that matters for the transition. Because this is the political scene in Tunisia and the political scene in Egypt, when opposition is concerned, for example, are very different. Because the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, in Egypt, are a strong opposition party, and this can really change things. In Tunisia, we have weaker opposition, very different people, and the people like the mass, the young, don't know them. That is the problem, that we don't have a reliable, known opposition in Tunisia. So that is one difference. Second, the situation in Egypt, there is too much at stake. The geographical position of Egypt is very delicate. So there is the border with Gaza, and there is too much at stake. So it won't only concern Egyptians, this transition.
Let me move this on.
I think
Go on.
I'm slightly concerned at sort of the mention of the Muslim Brotherhood, because ironically, in Tunisia, we actually have a figurehead for the Muslim Brotherhood. We have a Ghanouchi who flew back from exile to head a Muslim movement in Tunisia, which, again, you know, amazingly, the US haven't battered an eyelid at that. And in Egypt, where the Muslim Brotherhood is not actually a political party and do not have a single represented nominee in the Shura Council or in the parliament, effectively, people are overly scared. Again, there has been this scaremongering tactic of the Muslim Brotherhood coming into power in Egypt, and no, it's just simply not happened. We're not an Iran of 79. I would plead commentators to think about the example of Turkey, the Kuwait revolution, which sees a strong Islamic influence, but a secular and modern state.
Okay, but what you do have in Egypt, and what is clear when you compare it to Tunisia in a sense, is that Egypt does have a bigger position in what is happening in the Middle East. They have more vested interest, and therefore the rest of the world will have more of a vested interest in what happens in Egypt. And you're still not seeing a strong opposition in Egypt that can take the place of the leadership.
Correct. I mean, we understand the natural fears, any mention of any influence, and again, I say that this concept of a power vacuum, which, you know, we're trying to push the argument that it's unfounded. So we understand why these natural fears come along, but I think at more careful analysis, just looking at the way the protests have unfolded, the messages, the unification across the Egyptian people, you know, we plead to people to really look into it and see that there is no one distinct regime trying to take control. And again, in terms of the opposition, we actually do have a relatively well-positioned opposition, but who are hampered through the state media and through the Suleiman process. Or VP Suleiman basically saying, I'm willing to open negotiations, but the under-the-table messages are, don't try your luck with me.
Gennaro Gervasio, so we're down to the point of the opposition. Basically, in Tunisia, they stayed out of the protests, and now they're coming to the forefront, whereas in Egypt, it's a very mixed message. How do you see the picture of both countries?
Well, I mean, the picture is still very difficult to see. Clearly enough, I mean, part of the oppositions was behind the organization of the demonstration in the first, I mean, there were like youth movement like Sitta April the 6th and other. So the Muslim Brotherhood at the beginning, they were not part of it, but clearly very soon they moved in, including Al-Baradei and his National Association for Change, plus leftist group and so on. The question is that, you know, how can you speak of a transition whilst the regime is still there? And let's not forget that Omar Suleiman, that for some would be the figure, the transitionary period. I mean, he represents the regime even more than Mubarak in these days. But there is also another challenge for the opposition. It's not just to negotiate with the regime, because they've been doing with not much success, but for the last 20 years and more. The question is how not to make the street unhappy, because, you know, I know that they've been starting negotiation with the regime, with government, with elements in the government, including the new leader of NDP, Hossam Badran, who was being always called a reformer and quite close to some secular milieu in Egypt, like secular and leftist, to say this way, to put it in this way. But, you know, whilst Mubarak is still in power, I mean, so maybe the popular demand, you know, they have also, they are a challenge for the opposition in order not to make them unhappy, because for what I understand, the opposition might well decide to negotiate with Omar Suleiman towards the next elections. I mean, but at the moment, this is not what the Tahrir Square is asking for. So it's, there is a double challenge, you know, how to negotiate with the regime, and also how not to make too much, how not to widen the distance between the street and the people, the representatives of the opposition. Plus, it will be interesting to see whether there will be an emergence of new, younger leadership within the opposition, the one that emerged from the street politics, to put it in this way.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there, and thanks to our guests. In Tunis, Fidaa al-Hammami. In Sydney, we had Gennaro Gervasio. And in London, Yusuf Elbaz. Thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We, of course, welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. But for now, it's goodbye.